and the economy. Objectives. After we're done reading this section, we should be able to explain how railroads helped the West develop. We should be able to analyze how railroad services became more efficient over time and describe how railroads encouraged economic growth. And then the key terms in this section are gauge, network, consolidate, rebate, and pool. The Western mining boom had begun with the California Gold Rush of 1849. When the gold rush ended, miners looked for new opportunities. A mere rumor sent them racing east in search of new strikes. The railroad encourages economic growth. To many Native Americans, the railroad was a terrifying monster, an iron horse, belching black smoke and moving at stunning speeds. However, for the people of mining towns, railroads meant supplies, new townsfolk, and a rapid means of transporting their gold and silver. The West needed a transportation system that could carry heavy loads over great distances at a cost low enough to guarantee a profit. It is no wonder, then, that railroad companies raced to lay track to the miners and boomtowns. In time, the new technology of railroad transport opened the West and fostered economic growth for the nation. A national transportation system. Early railroads were short lines that served local communities. Many lines ran for no more than 50 miles. When passengers and freight reached the end of one line, they had to move to a train on a different line to continue their journey. Even if the lines had been connected, the problem would not have been eliminated. Different lines used different tracks of different gauges or widths. As a result, the trains from one line could not run on the tracks of another line. In general, the tracks of northern lines use different gauges from those of southern lines. An example would be if you have an Apple phone and somebody else has a Samsung, you have to use different chargers to charge them because they don't have the same charging port. And so the same thing with railroad lines, the tracks were different widths, and so the rail cars couldn't go on each other's stuff. However, in 1886, railroads in the South decided to adopt the northern gauge or width of track. On May 30th, Southern railroads stopped running so that work could begin. Using crowbars and sledgehammers, crews worked from dawn to dusk to move the rails a few inches further apart. When they had finished, some 13,000 miles of track had been changed. Once the track was standardized, American railroads formed a network or system of connected lines. The creation of a rail network brought benefits to shippers. Often, rail companies arranged for freight cars on one line to use the tracks of another. For example, goods loaded in Chicago could stay on the same car all the way to New York instead of being transferred from one car to another. As a result, the shipper had to pay only one fare for the whole distance. New rails knit the sprawling nation together. By 1900, there were more miles of tracks in the United States than in Europe and Russia combined. Westinghouse brakes and Pullman cars. New inventions helped make railroad travel safer and faster. On early trains, each railroad car had its own brakes and its own brake operator. So each separate car had to brake all the wheels on each car. If different cars stopped at different times, serious accidents could result. Kind of like if you're riding a bike and somebody in front of you slams on their brakes, what do? You hit them, right? Serious accidents could result. In 1869, George Westinghouse began selling his new air brake. Westinghouse's air brake allowed a locomotive engineer to stop all the railroad cars at once. The air brake increased safety and allowed for longer, faster trains. Long-distance travel also became more comfortable in 1864. George Pullman designed a railroad sleeping car. Pullman cars had convertible berths, which is an area for sleeping, as well as lavatories. A lavatory is a bathroom. Railroads also added dining cars. Porters, the people that carried baggage, Conductors and waiters attended to the needs of passengers. The railroads and economic growth. The growth of the railroads in the 1800s was one way in which a market economy led to greater prosperity. As William Vanderbilt pointed out, the railroads are built for men who invest their money. That is, the railroads were built to make money for the people who invested in them. Yet the railroads benefited many other people: the workers who laid the tracks, the employees who ran the trains, the passengers who rode the rails, and the businesses that filled the cars with cargo. People who lived in the towns that sprouted up along the rail lines also benefited. Ultimately, the railroads benefited the country as a whole. The expansion of the railroads brought significant changes in ways of producing, distributing, and consuming goods. Businesses brought raw materials on railroads to factories. Finished goods from those factories could be shipped far and wide for a reasonable price. Consumers, especially those far from cities, could now have access to more goods than ever before. The same held true for farm goods. Farmers had wider markets and consumers had more food choices. Consolidation brings efficiency. As railroads grew, they looked for ways to operate more efficiently or effectively. Small lines were often costly to run, so many companies began to consolidate or combine. Larger companies bought up smaller ones or forced them out of business. The Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, consolidated 73 companies into its system. Tough-minded business people led the drive for consolidation. Cornelius Vanderbilt was among the most powerful of these leaders. He was the son of a poor farmer. Vanderbilt earned one fortune in steamship lines. He then began to buy up railroad lines in New York State. Vanderbilt sometimes used ruthless tactics to force smaller owners to sell to him. In the early 1860s, he decided to buy the New York Central Railroad. The owners refused to sell. Vanderbilt then announced that New York Central passengers would not be allowed to transfer to his trains. With their passengers stranded and business dropping sharply, the New York Central owners gave in and sold their line to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt then bought up most of the lines between Chicago and Buffalo. By the time of his death in 1877, his companies controlled 4,500 miles of track and linked New York City to the Great Lakes region. Here's Cornelius Vanderbilt. If you've ever gone to North Carolina and went to the Biltmore Mansion, that is one of the huge mansions that was built in the late 1800s because of the Vanderbilt money. I believe that Cornelius Vanderbilt also built Grand Central Station in New York City. Other consolidations were soon underway. Before long, the major railroads of the United States were organized into a number of systems, directed by a handful of wealthy and powerful men. Railroads and competition. With builders rushing to share in the profits of the railroad boom, overbuilding occurred. Soon there were too many rail lines in some parts of the country. Between Atlanta and St. Louis, for example, 20 different lines competed for business. There was not nearly enough rail traffic to keep all these lines busy. Owners look for new ways to make a profit. What is another word for profit? Money. Especially in the West. There were too few people and therefore not enough paying customers. For the railroads to make a profit, competition was fierce. Rate wars broke out as rival railroads slashed their fares to win customers. Usually all the companies lost money as a result. Often, railroads were forced to grant secret rebates or secret discounts to their biggest customers. The railroads preferred big customers for two reasons. First, big customers were more likely to pay their bills and keep being customers in the future. Second, it was less expensive to deal with a few big customers than many small customers. Fewer customers meant less paperwork and simpler loading and unloading. Unfortunately, the practice of giving rebates hurt small shippers, such as farmers who still had to pay the full price. It even drove many small companies out of business. Railroad owners soon realized that cutthroat competition was hurting even their large lines. They looked for ways to end the competition. One method was pooling. In a pool, several railroad companies agreed to divide up the business in an area. They then fixed their prices at a high level. So here's a little chart that shows how the farmers and small businesses were not making out in this. You can look at that on your own. This chart shows different ways like industrial job growth and how railroad-related job growth, machinists, blacksmiths, and boil makers, how other jobs, people were making money because of the railroads. Railroads build a nation. Although railroads caused certain problems, they also made possible the rapid growth of industry after 1865. Building rail lines created thousands of jobs. Steelworkers turned millions of tons of iron into steel for tracks and engines. Lumberjacks cut down whole forests to supply wood for railroad ties. Miners sweated in dusty mine shafts digging coal to fuel railroad engines. The railroad companies themselves employed thousands of workers. They laid tracks, built trestles across rivers, carved tunnels through mountains, and built countless railroad stations. The large railroads also pioneered new ways of managing business. Rail companies created special departments for shipping and accounting and for servicing equipment. Expert managers headed each department, while chains of command ensured that the organization ran smoothly. Other big businesses soon copied these management techniques. Railroads opened every corner of the country to settlement and growth. They brought people together, especially in the West. New businesses sprang up, and towns sprouted where rail lines crossed. With rail lines in place, the United States was ready to become the greatest industrial nation the world had ever seen. All right. The rest of the time, I want you to